Some promises are too faithful to die, even after the voices that made them are gone. Rain drifted across the lonely coastline in slow silver threads, soft enough to whisper against the cedar siding of the small cabin overlooking the gray waters of Puget Sound. The wind carried the scent of salt, wet pine, and distant tide flats, filling the darkness with the kind of silence that belonged only to places where the world seemed to forget time. Nathan Walker had lived there alone for nearly 3 years. At 36, the former Navy SEAL had traded missions for mornings spent repairing fishing docks, chopping firewood, and pretending the quiet was enough to drown memories that still arrived before sunrise. His weathered pickup rested beneath a leaning spruce tree, its hood beaded with rain, while a single porch light cast a warm circle onto the soaked wooden steps. Inside, an old cast-iron stove crackled softly, pushing back the November chill. Nathan sat in a worn leather chair with a mug of black coffee cooling untouched beside him. A faded photograph rested face down on the table. He rarely looked at it anymore. Some memories stayed kinder when left unseen. Outside, the storm deepened. Branches swayed. Waves rolled against the rocky shoreline below the bluff with slow, patient rhythm. Then came a sound so gentle it almost disappeared beneath the rain. Knock. Nathan lifted his head. He waited. The cabin stood miles from the nearest neighbor, and nobody visited after dark unless something had gone terribly wrong. Another knock followed, lighter this time, followed by the faint scrape of something against old wood. He crossed the room without urgency, every instinct still alive beneath years of civilian life. His hand rested briefly on the doorknob before he pulled it open. The cold rushed inside first. Then he saw him. A German shepherd stood on the porch, barely able to remain upright. His sable coat was soaked flat against a frame far too thin for a working dog. Every rib showed beneath the wet fur. His paws trembled from exhaustion, and his amber eyes, clouded by fatigue, never left Nathan's face. The dog did not bark. He did not whine. He simply stood there as though every remaining ounce of strength had been spent reaching that single doorstep. Around his neck hung a weathered leather collar. Suspended beneath it was an old military dog tag, darkened by age and scarred by years of weather. As the wind shifted, the tag swung gently and tapped against the brass buckle with a quiet metallic click that somehow echoed louder than the storm itself. Nathan crouched slowly, keeping his movements calm. "Easy, buddy," he said, his voice almost lost beneath the rain. "You're safe now." The shepherd took one hesitant step forward before his legs weakened. Nathan caught him before he touched the porch, surprised by how little the dog weighed beneath the soaked coat. The shepherd rested his head against Nathan's shoulder for only a second. Not in surrender, not in fear, almost in recognition. Then, with what little strength remained, he turned his head toward the dark tree line beyond the cabin. His ears lifted, his eyes fixed on something hidden within the forest. He looked back at Nathan only once, as if asking a question no words could ever carry. The dog tag shifted again beneath the porch light. For the first time, Nathan noticed faint letters scratched into the worn metal. They were not a serial number. They were not a name. They were the beginning of a sentence that time had almost erased, and somehow, before he could even read the words, Nathan felt the impossible certainty that whoever had written them had expected this night to come. Nathan carried the exhausted German shepherd inside and closed the door against the wind, yet the dog never relaxed. The warmth from the cast-iron stove spread slowly through the cabin, filling the room with the scent of burning cedar, but the shepherd remained focused on the windows facing the dark forest beyond the bluff. Nathan laid an old wool blanket beside the fire and gently lowered the dog onto it. He disappeared into the kitchen, returned with a bowl of fresh water, then opened a can of plain chicken from the pantry, placing it carefully within reach. Most starving animals would have lunged without hesitation. This one only glanced at the food before lifting his eyes toward Nathan again. They were weary eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, yet steady with purpose. Nathan had seen that expression before. Years ago, it had belonged to teammates waiting for the exact moment to move, ignoring hunger, fatigue, and fear because something more important still waited ahead. The shepherd finally drank a few careful mouthfuls of water before taking several slow bites. Even then, he never stopped watching the front door. Nathan knelt beside him and gently brushed away damp fur from the weathered collar. The leather had cracked with age, and the brass buckle had faded almost black from rain and salt air. Hanging beneath it, the military dog tag rested cold against his fingers. He turned it toward the firelight. The front carried no readable identification anymore. Years of weather had erased nearly everything except faint scratches where letters had once been stamped. Nathan carefully flipped the tag over. There, carved by hand rather than machine, were words so shallow they nearly disappeared beneath the tarnish. He tilted the metal toward the flames until the light finally caught each uneven groove. Promise me. The sentence stopped there. The remaining letters had been worn away by time. Nathan frowned. He traced the unfinished message with his thumb, wondering who would carve such words onto a military tag instead of a name. The shepherd suddenly rose despite his weakness. His ears lifted. A low breath escaped his chest, not a growl, not a warning, but something closer to quiet insistence. He walked toward the front door, paused, then looked back over his shoulder. Nathan remained still. The dog repeated the motion, touching the bottom of the door lightly with his nose before looking back once more. It was impossible to misunderstand. He wanted Nathan to follow. Outside, the rain had eased into a fine mist that drifted through the towering evergreens. Nathan pulled on his waterproof jacket, slipped a flashlight into one pocket, and reached for an old lantern hanging beside the doorway. Before opening the door, he looked once more at the unfinished words on the tag. Promise me. 14 years earlier, another promise had echoed across a different night under a different sky, spoken by a voice Nathan had spent years trying not to remember. He could no longer recall the man's face clearly, but he still remembered the weight those words carried. The memory vanished as quickly as it appeared. Nathan shook his head, convincing himself it was nothing more than coincidence. Yet when he opened the door, the German shepherd stepped onto the rain-soaked porch with surprising determination. He waited only until Nathan joined him. Then, without a single bark or glance backward, the old dog turned toward the narrow trail disappearing into the black forest, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had already walked that path many times and believed, with every step that remained, this journey had always been meant for both of them. The narrow trail disappeared beneath towering Douglas firs whose branches gathered the drifting mist like old secrets refusing daylight. Nathan followed several steps behind the German shepherd, the lantern casting a warm circle that danced across damp moss, fallen needles, and smooth stones polished by decades of rain. Every few yards the dog slowed just enough to make certain Nathan remained behind him before continuing forward without hesitation. It was not the uncertain wandering of a stray searching for shelter. It was deliberate, purposeful, almost practiced. The forest breathed around them with quiet patience. Water dripped from cedar boughs. Somewhere beyond the darkness an owl called once before silence settled again. Nathan noticed something strange after nearly half a mile. The shepherd never sniffed the ground the way most dogs would. He did not search for a scent. He already knew exactly where he was going. The realization stirred something deep inside Nathan, something he had not felt since long nights navigating unfamiliar terrain guided only by trust in the teammate walking ahead. The path curved around a massive fallen cedar whose trunk had become covered in thick emerald moss. There the dog suddenly stopped. He lowered his head toward the weathered bark before looking at Nathan once more. Nathan swept the lantern across the enormous trunk. At first he saw nothing except layers of damp wood and clusters of pale mushrooms. Then the light settled upon several shallow cuts carved into the cedar years before. They were not random marks. Someone had carved an arrow pointing farther uphill. The edges had softened with age, nearly reclaimed by the forest itself. Nathan touched the carving with his fingertips. The grooves felt old, perhaps many seasons old, yet carefully made by someone determined that another person might one day find them. The shepherd waited quietly until Nathan stepped away from the tree. Only then did he continue climbing. Questions crowded Nathan's mind faster than the steady rhythm of his boots. Who had left these markers? Why would a trained military dog remember a forgotten trail through miles of wilderness? And why had the unfinished words on the dog tag awakened a memory he could never quite reach? As they climbed higher, the trees began to thin. The scent of salt faded, replaced by wet earth and cold mountain air. A gentle breeze stirred through the branches, carrying with it the faint fragrance of wild sage that should not have been growing this deep beneath the evergreens. Nathan paused. He knew that scent. Years ago, during survival training in the Cascade foothills, an older instructor had crushed sage between his hands before every exercise, claiming people remembered smells longer than words. Nathan could still hear the man laughing softly as he repeated the same sentence before each mission. Always leave a way home for someone else. The memory appeared so suddenly that Nathan stopped walking altogether. He could hear the voice clearly now, but the face remained hidden behind the fog of passing years. Before he could reach for the memory, the German shepherd let out a quiet breath and resumed climbing. Nathan looked down at the weathered collar disappearing into the darkness ahead. The old dog was no longer simply leading him through the forest. Somehow, step by careful step, he was leading him backward through forgotten pieces of his own life, toward a destination that seemed to have been waiting patiently long before the rain ever fell upon his lonely cabin. The climb grew steeper until the narrow trail opened onto a forgotten ridge overlooking the restless waters far below. The rain had almost stopped, leaving tiny drops clinging to every blade of grass like scattered glass beneath the pale glow of a hidden moon. The German shepherd slowed, his breathing heavier now, but there was still quiet determination in every careful step. Nathan noticed that the old dog never wandered from the faint path winding across the ridge, as though invisible footprints still guided him through the darkness. Ahead stood the remains of an abandoned fire lookout, little more than a weathered stone foundation and several leaning beams that had surrendered to decades of wind and winter. Moss covered nearly every surface, while climbing ivy wrapped itself around splintered timbers that had long ago ceased to resemble a building. The shepherd stopped at the edge of the clearing and sat for the first time since leaving the cabin. He looked toward the ruins instead of at Nathan, his amber eyes reflecting the lantern light with quiet expectation. Nathan stepped carefully across the uneven stones, each footfall stirring the scent of damp earth and cedar roots. Near the center of the old foundation, he found another mark carved into a flat piece of granite. It was the same style as the arrow on the fallen cedar, cut by a steady hand years earlier. Beneath the weathered arrow rested a single date. Most of the numbers had faded beneath moss, but one remained unmistakably clear. Nathan felt his pulse slow. It was the same year as one of the final operations before he retired from active service. He closed his eyes for only a moment, and another memory slipped through the cracks. A quiet briefing room, a table scattered with maps, one man smiling while absent-mindedly turning a military dog tag between his fingers. Nathan still could not remember the man's name, yet he remembered his voice with startling clarity. Calm, patient, the kind of leader who never needed to raise it. The memory vanished before Nathan could hold on to it. A soft metallic sound broke the silence. The shepherd had lowered his head, allowing the old tag around his neck to strike gently against a stone. Nathan knelt beside him and carefully lifted the weathered piece of metal once again. Under the brighter lantern light, dirt loosened from one narrow groove that had remained hidden beneath years of grime. He rubbed it gently with the edge of his sleeve. Another word slowly appeared beneath the unfinished message. Promise me, finish it. Nathan stared without moving. His throat tightened. Finish what? The question lingered in the cold night air with no answer. The shepherd rose before Nathan could think further and walked toward the far edge of the clearing where dense blackberry vines covered what appeared to be an old wooden post. Instead of forcing his way through, the dog simply stood there, waiting. Nathan pushed aside the tangled branches until the lantern revealed a faded green military ammunition box tucked beneath the vines, protected from the weather by an overhanging slab of stone. Dust covered every inch of its surface, yet the rusted latch remained intact. Nathan reached toward it slowly, his fingertips stopping only inches away as a strange feeling settled over him. It was not fear. It was recognition. Somehow he knew that whatever rested inside the forgotten box had been waiting through countless seasons, trusting that one faithful dog would someday bring the right man back before time erased the last promise forever. The rusted latch resisted at first, as though the old ammunition box had forgotten how to open after years beneath rain and moss. Nathan pressed a little harder until the metal released with a dull click that echoed through the quiet clearing. The lid lifted slowly, revealing no weapons, no classified documents, and no forgotten equipment. Inside rested a neatly folded American flag protected inside a weathered waterproof bag, a small leather notebook wrapped with faded cord, and a silver challenge coin darkened by time. Nothing else. Nathan removed the notebook carefully. The leather felt dry despite the damp air, preserved by whoever had hidden it with remarkable care. As he untied the cord and opened the first page, he found a familiar style of handwriting, steady and deliberate, written with black ink that had softened to deep brown over the years. The first sentence stopped him completely. "If you are reading this, then Ghost finally found the right man." Nathan whispered the dog's name without realizing it. "Ghost." The shepherd lifted his head from where he rested beside the stone foundation. His ears twitched gently at the sound, and for the first time since arriving at the cabin, his tired tail moved once across the wet grass. Nathan looked back at the page, his heartbeat slowing as another forgotten memory rose from somewhere deep inside him. A training field years earlier. A younger German shepherd racing across an obstacle course with effortless confidence. Beside him stood a broad-shouldered Navy SEAL whose calm smile never seemed to disappear, even during the hardest days. The man's voice came back with perfect clarity. "Meet Ghost. He is smarter than both of us." Nathan almost smiled at the memory before sadness quietly settled over him. The face finally became clear. Lieutenant Daniel Brooks. Mentor. Friend. The man who had welcomed Nathan onto his first special operations team with a handshake instead of a speech. Daniel had believed that trust was built through quiet consistency rather than loud promises. He carried that silver challenge coin everywhere and absent-mindedly turned it between his fingers whenever he was thinking. Nathan looked down at the coin resting inside the box. The worn eagle engraved across its surface left no room for doubt. It belonged to Daniel. He turned another page in the notebook. The entries were not mission reports. They were simple observations written during long deployments. Ghost learned to wait before every doorway. Ghost still refuses to eat until everyone else is finished. Ghost knows when someone is pretending to be strong. Nathan swallowed hard. Every line spoke less about military work than about loyalty, patience, and the quiet bond between one man and one remarkable dog. Near the middle of the notebook, Daniel's handwriting changed slightly, as though written during great exhaustion. "If anything ever keeps me from coming home, I need someone to finish one promise for me. I cannot ask Ghost to carry it forever." Nathan closed his eyes. He remembered now that Daniel had disappeared during a classified mission shortly before Nathan left active duty. No public ceremony had ever followed. No official explanation had reached the team. Eventually, everyone learned to stop asking questions because some absences never received answers. Ghost slowly walked beside Nathan and rested his head against his shoulder once more. Nathan placed one hand gently upon the old shepherd's neck. The years suddenly made sense. Ghost had never been searching for food. He had never been wandering without purpose. Through countless seasons, storms, and lonely miles, he had been protecting one unfinished promise, believing with unwavering faith that somewhere, somehow, the one man who could finally complete it would still remember the way back. The wind moved gently across the clearing, carrying the scent of cedar and damp earth as Nathan turned the next page with careful hands. Every word seemed less like a journal entry and more like a conversation that had been waiting years to continue. Daniel had written with remarkable simplicity, never trying to sound heroic, never pretending certainty belonged to life. One passage had been underlined twice. "If Ghost ever comes back without me, do not feel sorry for him. Help him finish what I could not." Nathan stared at the sentence until the ink blurred beneath, gathering moisture in his eyes. He remembered the countless mornings Daniel had insisted that every mission eventually ended, but character never did. A uniform could be folded away. A rank could disappear. Even memories could fade. But a promise remained alive as long as someone still chose to honor it. Ghost rested quietly beside him, his breathing slow and uneven after the long climb. The old shepherd no longer watched the forest. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Nathan, calm with the patient confidence of someone who had finally reached the end of an impossibly long journey. Nathan reached into the ammunition box once more and unfolded the weatherproof pouch protecting the American flag. Tucked beneath it lay a single sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed with age, but Daniel's handwriting across the front remained unmistakable. For Nathan Walker. Only if Ghost brings you here. Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He carefully broke the aging seal and unfolded the letter inside. The handwriting was steadier than he expected, almost peaceful. Nathan, if you are reading this, then life unfolded in ways neither of us could predict. You once told me that every man hopes someone remembers him after he is gone. I realized later that remembrance is not enough. What matters is whether the good we leave behind continues to help someone else stand back up. That is why I asked Ghost to remember this place. Not because of me, but because of what is buried beneath these stones. Nathan lowered the page and looked around the silent foundation. Until that moment, he had assumed the abandoned lookout itself held the meaning. Now he understood it was only a marker. He picked up the lantern and slowly walked across the clearing. Ghost struggled to his feet and quietly followed, stopping beside a broad flat stone nearly hidden beneath moss and fallen pine needles. The shepherd touched it once with his nose, then looked at Nathan without moving again. Nathan knelt and brushed away years of damp leaves. Carved into the stone was a small wooden cross, no larger than the palm of his hand, and beneath it another familiar sentence in Daniel's handwriting. Always leave a way home for someone else. Nathan closed his eyes as the final memory returned in perfect clarity. Years earlier, after a difficult mission, Daniel had brought him to this very ridge at sunrise. They had stood together looking across the water while Ghost chased the morning breeze through the grass. Daniel had smiled and quietly said that if life ever scattered them, this place would always remind someone that hope deserved a landmark too. Nathan opened his eyes and looked at the faithful shepherd beside him. At last he understood. Ghost had not spent years searching for the man who could remember Daniel. He had spent years searching for the man who would understand why remembering was only the beginning. For a long time Nathan remained kneeling before the weathered stone, listening to nothing except the quiet rhythm of Ghost's breathing and the gentle wind passing through the evergreens. The forest no longer felt abandoned. It felt patient, as though every tree had silently guarded this place until the right footsteps finally returned. Nathan folded Daniel's letter with the same care someone might use to protect a family photograph and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he placed the silver challenge coin in the center of his palm. Its worn edges carried years of fingerprints, quiet decisions, and ordinary moments that history would never record. He remembered how Daniel would spin it across the back of his fingers while listening instead of speaking. It had never been a lucky coin. It had simply reminded him to stay grounded when everything around him demanded certainty. Nathan looked down at Ghost. The old shepherd lowered himself onto the damp grass with a tired sigh, but there was something different in his eyes now. The restless urgency that had carried him across miles of wilderness had softened into quiet expectation. He was waiting, not to continue the journey, but to see whether the journey had truly reached its purpose. Nathan stood and slowly walked around the stone foundation until he reached the far edge of the clearing where several young cedar trees had grown in a loose circle. Their trunks were still slender, no thicker than a man's wrist, and they swayed gently beneath the fading storm clouds. Daniel's words returned once more. What matters is whether the good we leave behind continues to help someone else stand back up. Nathan suddenly understood the promise that had remained unfinished all these years. It had never been about protecting a hidden location or preserving forgotten memories. Daniel had wanted this lonely place to become a beginning instead of an ending. Nathan searched the abandoned lookout one final time. Resting beneath a collapsed wooden beam, he found an old forestry shovel with a weathered handle that had somehow survived countless winters. He brushed away the moss, gripped the smooth wood, and carried it beside the clearing. The soil was rich from years of fallen needles, soft enough to turn with gentle effort. Nathan knelt and began digging carefully near the tallest young cedar. Ghost watched every movement without making a sound. When the hole was deep enough, Nathan folded the American flag with quiet respect exactly as Daniel had once taught him during a ceremony long ago. He did not bury it. Instead, he placed the waterproof pouch containing the notebook beneath the cedar roots while keeping the flag, the challenge coin, and Daniel's letter with him. The notebook belonged here because its lessons belonged to anyone who might one day discover this place. The other items belonged with the living because promises could only continue through hands still willing to carry them. Nathan covered the small bundle with fresh earth before placing a flat river stone on top as a simple marker. No names, no dates, no explanation, only a place that invited kindness instead of curiosity. Then he removed the weathered dog tag from Ghost's collar and gently cleaned away the last traces of dirt with the sleeve of his jacket. Under the pale morning light breaking through the clouds, the remaining letters became clearer than ever before. Promise me. Finish it. Then help someone else find the way home. Nathan closed his eyes. The sentence was complete at last. He fastened the tag carefully back on a Ghost's collar, his hands steadier than they had been in years. The old shepherd slowly struggled to his feet and stepped toward Nathan. For a quiet moment, neither of them moved. Then Ghost rested his head against Nathan's chest, and Nathan wrapped both arms around the faithful dog without saying a single word. The embrace needed no explanation. One promise had finally reached its end, and at that same moment another had quietly begun, carried not by orders, not by duty, but by the simple choice to become for someone else the safe doorway that Ghost had searched so faithfully to find. By the time Nathan and Ghost began the walk back down the mountain, the first light of dawn had quietly slipped between the evergreens, turning every drop of rain into a tiny spark of gold. The storm had passed without anyone noticing exactly when it ended. Even the wind seemed gentler now, carrying only the scent of cedar, fresh earth, and the distant salt water waiting beyond the trees. Ghost no longer hurried. His steady determination had become an unhurried peace. Every few yards he paused, not because he had forgotten the trail, but because there was finally no reason to rush. Nathan matched his pace without speaking. Some journeys asked for conversation. Others deserved silence. As they reached the old fallen cedar marked with the carved arrow, Ghost stopped beside the weathered trunk one last time. He looked toward the forest behind them, then slowly turned away. Nathan understood without needing another explanation. The place no longer needed a guardian. The promise had found its ending. The remainder of the trail felt strangely familiar, as though every mile had become shorter now that its purpose had been revealed. Birds gradually replaced the silence that had surrounded the mountain during the night. Somewhere overhead, an eagle circled through the clearing sky before disappearing toward the coastline. Nathan smiled faintly. Daniel had always said that mornings had a way of making impossible burdens seem lighter without changing their weight. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, its porch glowed beneath the soft amber light that Nathan had forgotten to switch off. Ghost climbed the wooden steps with slow, careful movements. He paused at the same place where he had first collapsed only hours earlier. This time he did not hesitate. He walked inside as though he already belonged there. Nathan filled a clean bowl with fresh water and prepared a simple breakfast of chicken and rice. Ghost ate quietly, no longer watching the door between every bite. When he finished, he drank deeply before wandering toward the stone fireplace. There he circled the old wool blanket once, lowered himself onto it, and released a long, peaceful breath. Nathan sat nearby with Daniel's letter resting in his hands. The cabin, once filled with the heavy silence of loneliness, now carried a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet that follows forgiveness rather than absence. The old clock above the mantel ticked steadily while sunlight slowly filled the room. Ghost watched Nathan for another moment. His amber eyes, once sharpened by relentless purpose, had become calm enough to reflect nothing except the dancing firelight. Nathan reached down and gently rested his hand against the shepherd's neck. The weathered dog tag remained warm beneath his fingertips. It no longer felt like a burden carried across forgotten years. It felt like the final page of a story that had finally been read aloud. Ghost closed his eyes without fear, his breathing slow and even, trusting the peaceful rhythm of the cabin around him. Nathan remained beside him for a long while, saying nothing at all. Outside, the rainwater dripped softly from the roof onto the porch where the first mysterious knock had changed everything. Inside, one weary man and one faithful dog simply shared the warmth of a new morning. There was no miracle anyone else could photograph. No headline waiting to be written. Only a quiet home where an old promise had finally been allowed to rest, and where, for the first time in many years, neither soul needed to keep watch through the night. Autumn quietly gave way to winter, and the little cabin overlooking Puget sound no longer felt like a place where time had stopped. Every morning Nathan opened the front door before sunrise, not because he expected someone to arrive, but because hope deserved an open doorway. Ghost had regained his strength little by little. His coat grew thick again beneath the cool coastal air, and although age had slowed his steps, a quiet dignity returned to the way he carried himself. Some afternoons they walked together along the shoreline where driftwood rested against the tide and gulls floated above the silver water. Other days they returned to the mountain ridge, never searching for answers anymore, only visiting the place where one promise had finally become peace. Nathan repaired the weathered trail markers before each season changed, making certain anyone who wandered there could find the path safely. He never added names or explanations. The mountain did not need another monument. It simply needed someone willing to care for it. Before long, hikers occasionally discovered the clearing and found a small wooden bench overlooking the water. Nathan had built it from fallen cedar without carving a single dedication into the wood. People often sat there quietly before continuing home, unaware that the greatest gifts are sometimes left by people they will never meet. Ghost always rested beneath the young cedar tree while Nathan watched the sunrise spread across the sound. The old shepherd seemed lighter there, as though the invisible weight he had carried across so many lonely years had finally slipped away with the morning mist. One calm spring afternoon, Ghost slowly walked onto the porch after their usual walk, settled onto the same wool blanket beside the fireplace, and looked toward Nathan with peaceful amber eyes. Nathan knelt beside him, resting one hand gently against the weathered collar where the old dog tag still hung. The metal no longer represented sorrow or unfinished duty. It had become a quiet reminder that love can outlive memory when someone chooses to keep living its lessons. Ghost leaned softly into Nathan's hand, released one long, contented breath, and drifted into a deep, comfortable sleep. Nathan smiled and quietly whispered, "You made it home, partner." Outside, the breeze stirred through the cedar branches with the same gentle sound that had greeted them on the mountain. Inside, the fire crackled softly while warm afternoon light stretched across the wooden floor. Nathan unfolded Daniel's letter one last time before placing it inside a small cedar box alongside the silver challenge coin. He left the box on the mantel where every new day would begin beneath it. Years later, neighbors would remember the quiet veteran who always helped strangers find lost trails, repaired broken fences without being asked, and never let anyone leave his porch hungry or alone. They would also remember the old German shepherd who greeted every visitor with calm eyes and gentle patience, as though he already believed there was goodness waiting inside every soul. No one outside that little circle ever knew the full story. They never saw the hidden notebook beneath the cedar roots or understood why one weathered dog tag remained polished despite its age. They simply felt something peaceful whenever they stepped through Nathan's open door. Perhaps that was the promise all along. Not to preserve the past, but to let kindness continue long after the people who first inspired it were gone. And somewhere beyond the reach of memory, where faithful hearts are never forgotten, one quiet promise finally became the way home for countless others.